and welcome. I'm Dr. Heléna Kate, and today we are going to be entering into the raw, revealing, and redemptive conversation about the shadow feminine. So, as I started moving into this topic, I was feeling it quite strongly. This isn't a topic about fault or blame. It's really about an invitation. It's an opportunity to look honestly and compassionately at parts of ourselves that have been shaped in silence or twisted by survival or buried under the weight of what we thought we had to be in order to be loved. So you can just take a moment, take a breath. Let yourself soften, let your truth rise, and we can begin. So, first off, what is the shadow feminine? So, the shadow feminine is not necessarily about something dark in the way that we often feel or fear darkness. It's not evil or shameful or wrong. It's simply what has been repressed, distorted, or denied. And when we're talking about feminine energy in general, we're not speaking about gender identity. Feminine energy exists in all of us, regardless of our gender. And it lives in how we relate, how we receive, how we love, how we hold the unknown. So, in its light, the feminine is intuition, compassion, presence, beauty, and surrender. And in its shadow, the feminine becomes manipulation, seduction, over emotional dependence or emotional overdependence, and self sacrifice or convert control. So they don't, these patterns don't necessarily start with us, meaning that we don't just opt to be this way, but they begin in the places where we weren't seen, where we're told that our softness makes us weak, where we're told we had to, or we felt we had to trade in our truth for safety or connection. So as we do this, it starts to develop parts of us, or parts of us go into shadow. And as these parts go into shadow, they find like indirect, you could call them indirect ways of expressing themselves. And these indirect ways, that's why it's often called manipulation, or it represents other kind of problematic behaviors, because the behavior itself is not really allowing itself to be seen in the full light. So it's in the shadow. Right? So it's, what does it mean then? We can ask that question. What does it mean to allow something to be seen in full light? So what is seen in light, we could say simply, is not hidden. It's seen in its fullness for what it is. It allows itself to be known in relationship to everything. It is fully transparent, fully willing to be seen. So the parts of us that we don't allow to fully be seen, that we hide in some way, are what lives in our shadow. That's kind of what exists in our shadow. And so the roots of our shadow are in our response to pain, especially relational pain. So this is where we feel abandoned, rejected, silenced, not chosen. In these places, our energy learns to adapt, right? So it learns to perform, to hide, to please, to manipulate, to seduce, or to withdraw. So the response, first of all, we're learning that the response is in relationship to some kind of a difficult experience, and that it is an adaptation to this experience. So we want to do that. Why is that so important? That's important so that we don't label or judge or this way of being, that we don't make it so wrong, that we recognize that it is in relationship to some kind of a wound that happened, right? Because that allows for a different thing to take place, a different type of compassion, love, respect to be in the mix when the wound that got there, it doesn't make the person bad. It recognizes that the behavior is an adaptation to what is happening. So, some of the ways that we might learn this, right? We might learn that being desirable meant quiet, or being desirable meant that we don't have needs, or that our feelings are too much, or that in order to we have to earn love through sacrifice or through performance. And so all of these things show us that basically who we are is not in itself, acceptable. It is not like kind of worthy of living in the light. And so that we then sort of it splits off into the shadow. So these are not just beliefs, they're not just thought patterns, they're energetic patterns that live in our whole system. And they show up in relationship often without our really realizing it, or sometimes when we do realize it. But this is something that we're, want to emphasize that it's a pattern, because it's not just like, oh, I have a belief and I need to change my belief. We have energetic patterns that get put in place that often show up in relationship, which also means that as we get into this a little bit, they need to be healed in relationship too. So if there's a relational wound, it can't be healed in isolation. It actually needs to be healed in relationship to others. Right? So this isn't something that, like, I'm not speaking about this today because this is something that I haven't encountered, or that I haven't struggled with in my own life, but rather because I have. Right. So there are, if we go back through my life, I could probably point out every pattern that would be in this category, having shown up in my life at some point in time, right? So I've stayed too long in things, I've given too much, I've silenced my truth, I've used manipulation, I've used seduction, all of those things in order to try to balance my world, in order to try to be able to protect, preserve, care for myself in some way. So that's another component of this. Another component is recognizing that these adaptations are actually there to try to care for us. It's another way that we don't make it wrong or bad. It's so important. There's so much negativity focused towards the shadow feminine, which really just keeps it entrenched. So it's really important that we start to understand that it's like these are adaptations, and the adaptations are made in order to try to survive in a place where a person has been very compromised. So other options for this, right, are places of like withholding, retreat, maintaining control, right? All of those things can show up when we're afraid of being hurt. And this is the shadow, right? And it doesn't need punishment. It doesn't need judgment. It needs a presence. It needs our attention and care first and foremost. And it also needs to have the a healing process, to be brought into a healing process in the world. So there's a lot of reasons that the shadow, takes root, right? And some of that is because we have very few actual representations of healthy feminine role models. Right? And this creates a significant amount of confusion and self-doubt. So we're most often, if we're talking about how the feminine exists inside of women and men, where we don't have a lot of examples of how the feminine lives in its full health and well-being. And because of this, we can't really find how to live it in our lives, like what the alternative is, what we might be able to do. to create an alternative. And is because one of the things that helps us overall is being able to see these healthy role models. So very often what we have examples of in the feminine are the opposite. They are the shadow feminine. And this then doesn't we don't really have a place to turn. So it's one of the ways that we can work with archetypes. We can use archetypes to help us understand more of the healthy feminine if we're not seeing that represented more in our life. But it's also our responsibility, each and every one of us, to create more of this healthy feminine in our life so that we can heal this in our world. So our trauma also shapes this, right? Because as we are experience the wounding of life, the traumas of life, the difficulty of life, then we're going to have our natural fawn, freeze, response to to things that happen in our life, right? So the when we want to understand that this trauma is going to shape our relational instincts, and it's going to push us in times into the shadow feminine. So when are we most going to see the shadow feminine come out? We're going to see it inside of relationships. When are we going to see it most prominent? It's in relationships that start to access, point to, or highlight areas of trauma that we have. And so as we start to become aware of that in ourselves and also in others, we can say, oh, okay, if I'm going here, right? If I'm stepping into relationship, first of all, right, which is existent in all the ways, as soon as we start to step out of our patterns into more authentic relationship, we're going to be in the realm of a problem, essentially. And then as soon as we hit on a particular trauma, right, we're going to see the dynamics of the shadow feminine come out in their full form. So we can kind of know that when we see these dynamics, that something's been hit on. We might not know what it is that's been hit on, but something has been activated inside of us or inside of another person. And that it's not our job. We'll talk about this a little bit more in relational dynamics. It's not our job to fix that, meaning it's not our job to fix it if it's in someone else. It is our job to fix it if it's inside of us. So to become aware of when those dynamics are being activated and to try to do things to shape or reshape what it is that is happening. So that we want to be aware of how that's acting again, because we're bringing compassion to this. And one of the things that really harms, adds more fuel to the fire, adds more pain to the situation, is when the kind of the complexity of the situation or the dynamics of the situation are understood, and that it's like tried to be managed with logic or with over control or things like that. It's sort of like you try to use some masculine force to push it into its place. And that's kind of how the toxic masculine, the shadow masculine, gets highlighted in relationship to it, and both inside of us and interpersonally, that the response is then to try to control or dominate this energy. And this forces the feminine even more into hiding and even more into shadow. So there's a different the stability of response, clarity of response, stability of response, the ability to respond to or understand what it is that's going on, but to not kind of force it is what is required or helpful to the healing movement. However, again, we want to remember that, like, when any kind of toxic anything or shadow anything is the person, it's the person who's holding that energy that is responsible for dealing with that energy, for taking care of it. So we each clean up our own side of the street. We each take care of what it is that's inside of us, right? And then we can get help and assistance and things like that from other people who are around us, or there might be people who are willing to be supportive in the process. But ultimately, it's not anyone else's job, but ours to do that work. So very often, the reason that people don't go down this road, but women in particular don't go down this road of healing, looking at the shadow feminine, and they unconsciously reject their own feminine power, is because they equate that the experience of their femininity, you could say, as powerlessness. So that's part of the wound that, like, puts this all in motion. So as the aspects of the feminine and what would be, positive or feminine energy or of the light, as that is as uh, shown to, it's like it's proven dangerous to be that way. It's too vulnerable to be that way, or some other form of powerlessness is seen or felt, then this leads to women rejecting that aspect of themselves that is, like, intuitive and receptive and open, because basically it's that it isn't safe to be open, so that then the woman needs to manipulate or control her environment so that there is a feeling of safety. So how do we know if we're coming from the shadow? Right? So the integrated feminine energy, the true feminine energy, right, is going to emerge from a grounded presence. It's going to feel open and calm, and magnetic, not necessarily needy or grasping. So it doesn't need to run after, it can draw to it in the best possible ways. It's sourced from love, not from lack. That's a really important piece of the equation. So there needs to be enough fundamental love in the mix in order for the integrated feminine, to be present. If there isn't enough love in the mix, then basically the shadow feminine starts to come out. So we need to cultivate love in ourselves and for ourselves in order to hold ourselves in that light. So the integrated feminine is going to hold beauty and boundaries and receptivity and balance. So beauty, boundaries, and receptivity. So it's able to hold all of those energies in a way that helps and supports both the woman or the person themselves, and also those who are around them. It has space for emotions without needing to control others through them. So in other words, your emotions don't dictate other people's experiences. And that can happen on all sorts of levels. We often feel justified that whatever is going on for us emotionally means that other people need to accommodate it in some way. We see a lot of that in our world. And really, I mean, we can have our emotions as much as we want, but no one actually needs to do anything about them. And they most certainly don't need to bow to our wishes as a result of our having a particular emotion. And you're going to feel empowered within yourself, regardless of how others respond. So an example of that would be to express a need or desire clearly and lovingly without attachment to the outcome. And then you trust your inner self-worth around that. So if you find yourself really reeling when you're not getting the type of response that you are wanting, then that's a good sign that you're not really feeling fully balanced in that feminine energy. Because the feminine energy, it knows itself, it knows its own intrinsic worth and value, in a deep way. So the shadow feminine emerges from wounded or unacknowledged parts. It's often reactive, anxious, manipulative, or performative, right? So it doesn't, you could, a way of saying that is it doesn't really have access to the essence or the true nature of the person. It's kind of like bouncing around more on the surface, and it hasn't found its way to really ground into the depth of who what it is, who it is. It tries to get love, validation, or security through indirect means, right? So this could be, like an indirect comment, for example, could be like, do I look fat in this? Would be an example of that. Or somehow finding a way to manipulate others to give you what you want. So that could be, sometimes women will like excessively compliment, or they'll try to be particularly good or something like that, in order to get love, instead of just engaging in relationship. So it uses seduction, guilt, withdrawal, or overgiving to feel into control, to feel in control or needed, right? So basically, this is more manipulation in order to, but this is in relationship to power rather than trying to get love. So it's trying to get power through various different means. So this can include, trying to make someone feel guilty, or trying to kind of manipulate them into being in your control through giving too much or not giving at all. And you can feel drained or ashamed or resentful afterwards. So, another thing would be you don't feel very good after you act that way. Where if you're in your full energy, feminine energy and flow, you're going to feel great afterwards. So, one of the signs is how do you feel? And so if you're not feeling good, then that is a pretty good sign, and there's a lot of work to be done here, because it isn't like you are just in one energy or the other. Sometimes you're in the feminine, positive feminine energy, and then some shadow will show up, or you'll flip flop in between things. So, recognizing that and starting to recognize when when your energy is running from a particular place, and it gives you an opportunity to regroup. So you can ask yourself, are you expressing from fullness or for fear? Do you feel more alive or honest or tight and hidden? Are you willing to be seen as you truly are? Right? Is this about connection or control? Those are questions you can ask yourself to kind of see if you're coming from the right energy. And also to assess whether or not somebody is coming to you with the right energy, right? So, like that, you can assess whether or not somebody is coming at you in a clean way. So, again, it's really important to stop and say, like, like the shadow feminine isn't wrong so much, it's just misdirected. It's misdirected wisdom. So it's like every time that you notice this part of you without shame, you already have you're inviting healing and integration. So again, we're talking about like the sensitivity to the fact that, like, all the labeling and the judging and the condemning of this energy is just like, whether internal or external, is preventative of the energy healing. What is actually like of their moving, of their being healing. And what we're wanting is we're wanting to we're wanting to create clarity. We're wanting to bring things, move things in the direction of the light. So we're wanting to bring these patterns forward and have them show up like show up in their higher evolution. So, how do these patterns show up in relationship? Right. So let's look first of all at what these patterns might look like. Right. Over giving too much, feeling to feel needed or loved. Seduction for control, using charm or sexuality to gain safety or dominance, emotional manipulation, withholding, guilt tripping, or passive aggressiveness to get a response, self erasure, abandoning your truth to keep someone close, spiritual bypassing, using spiritual ideals to avoid feeling or pain or anger or grief. And then an especially sneaky one is spiritual superiority, which pretending to be above drama, above needs, above conflict, when really it's fear, disconnection, and that is dressed as grace. So these are overall, again, they're not signs of failure, they're invitations to deeper healing. It's an opportunity for us to like notice if we're doing any of these things and start to bring it further to the light. So, for example, we can explore common phrases or behaviors like, I'm fine, right? If you're not, or if I do this, this person will change. Or maybe it's because I did or didn't do this that I'm getting a particular result. So we want to start to see how it's working inside of us, how these patterns are starting to work inside of us. And it's also important to remember how the unintegrated shadow leads to drama cycles, boundary confusion, and codependence. So if we look at that, if we see a particular pattern that is replicating itself over time, or a particular cycle of drama, right? Or a particular way where we're not able to create clarity around our boundaries in relationship, then these are all signs, right, that we're coming from this unintegrated shadow. So any place that we start to see these patterns, right, we want to look closely and say, how might the shadow feminine be showing up in this particular uh, place in my life? The other thing that is good to take a look at is how our unhealed shadow really can show up as nervous system dysregulation. So anxiety, numbing, obsessive thinking, obsessive thinking in love in particular, so kind of compulsive patterns in love. And so that nervous system like dysregulation is something that is a sign that we are in this shadow part of ourselves, but it is also the pattern itself is going to get us even more deeply into shadow patterns. So we want to recognize this and start to take steps to rebalance, right? To create more regulation in our life overall. So again, these are patterns that they are there to protect us and to help us survive. That's why they got put in place. It's not a moral failing. It's not something that is like wrong about a person. It's an adaptation, and that adaptation can be shifted or changed. What's necessary for that is that there is a desire to change that particular pattern, right? So when is it kind of past the point of working on a particular pattern? When there's no interest in actually changing it. So if there is an interest in changing it, all things are possible. So a lot of times, like I was saying, these patterns get put in place early, so there isn't even really a knowledge of what it is that there can be done differently. So we need patience around that. So how do we work with these elements inside of relationship, right? And that's another, we're going to take a look at that right now. So we've talked about how the shadow feminine shows up. and let's talk about how we can work with her, right? So within ourselves, within our relationships, because it's one thing to see it, right? And but it's another thing to be able to actually meet that part of ourselves again, inside and outside, with wisdom and love. And so that's where the real transformation takes place. And so when we're willing to do that, or when we start to develop the skills to do that, then we can really start to shift these patterns. As we shift these patterns in ourselves, we can help shift these patterns in others. In ourselves, we want to cultivate conscious awareness, not judgment. I've mentioned that several times, right? So when a pattern arises, we see the pattern that we're doing. Our job is to just simply pause and ask ourselves, what are we trying to protect? And what are we afraid will happen if we stop the behavior? So first we want to know what those patterns are that are connected to the shadow feminine. And then we ask the question, what am I trying to protect? And what am I afraid will happen if I stop this behavior? We want to create space between a trigger and response. So what helps us do that are emotional regulation tools, right? So the feminine can be intense, and so create space to feel fully without collapsing into chaos or performance, right? So it can be a lot to start to bring this part of us online. Like sometimes, part of it is like more than we feel that we can handle. And so we need to learn how to be with this energy. That's part of it. That's part of cultivating like awareness and ability to hold the fullness and the intensity of the emotional energy, as to develop our vessel in a way that can actually hold that, whether that's our personal vessel or that's a relational vessel. We're building out something that then can actually hold the energies that are involved. And we want to work with emotional regulation tools. You can say breath work or grounding or journaling or whatever it is that allows you to be able to work and process your emotions or regulate your emotions. So we also want to honor her original intention. So this part of ourselves, we want to honor the original intention. So every shadow behavior had a purpose. A purpose was to survive, to be loved, to feel safe. And so it's essential that we honor that intention, and so that we can loosen the grip and we can feel more self-compassion. So there would be no need for the shadow if everything was great along the way. So there has to be something that was threatened, whether that was survival, love, or safety. And in order for this, like, kind of this negative shadow aspect to come up, and then all we're really looking at is that when those behaviors happen, they are simply responses or reactions or adaptations to these damaging events. And so when we see that in ourselves, then we can say, oh, okay, right. There was something good about this. I learned to manipulate so that, right? I learned to withhold so that, I learned to compensate, in like give up myself so that, oh, okay, now I understand why I did that. All right, now let's look at it another way, right? But we have to honor, really have to honor. It's so incredibly important. There's nothing like that sticks, makes this work stick, like disrespect, because it's just such a core part of the wound. So so healing, you don't want to isolate yourself in this work. So first of all, this is healing that's done relationally, whether that's liked or not. Yes, there is work that you can do individually on this, but like by and large, the wounding is going to show up relationally, and it's going to be worked on relationally. And that's why this understanding is so important. Without this understanding of like some of the things that I was talking about, the original intention, the dynamics that are behind it, we're basically just allowing the we're holding the problem in place. But as we start to understand these things, we hold relationship differently. And then we're able from there to create more trust. It's like and as we create more trust, these kind of issues start to work through. They can find their resolution. And like, how do we know if like they can be worked through or not? We don't 100% know. We can predict, we can guess based on what it is that we see. But if there's enough intent and desire to do it, and there's the right kind of holding and care for it, then absolutely these dynamics can be transformed. You have to understand that this is what you're going to contend with, like whenever you start getting into areas of challenge, right? That's kind of the nature of it. So you have to learn to be able to care and sort of undo your own shadow. And then you also have to learn to be able to hold that space for other people, and then to be able to work like together. We need to work together to heal this particular piece of things. It's not like you can't just send a woman to the corner and say, hey, do your work. And when you do, you'll come back and think that the shadow feminine is going to be taken care of. It's not. It's going to actually be much more inflamed. So starting to transform these elements, seeing what they are adaptations to situations, and learning to turn them into something that's positive and of the light, right? So that's our job, right? So we're going to see something, we're going to see an adaptation, we're going to see an aspect of the shadow feminine, and then we start to see like to move it in the direction of being honored, loved, and seen, and then transmuted. So we accept it and then we transmute it. But what about if we see this in another person? What then will we do if we try to see that, if we see this in another person, we're trying to work with someone, right? So first step, you don't try to fix or rescue, right? So if someone is expressing shadow over guilt, giving guilt, control, it's not your job to fix them. It's not your job to like get involved in any kind of way. It's actually just your responsibility to stay in truth. That's the only thing that you need to do. Now, cannot like does the staying in truth means you really need to stay in truth. You can't pretend truth. You can't like kind of put a nice face on things. You can't that kind of stuff. When that's done, when someone says I'm standing in my truth, but they're not, they're really just like off putting responsibility, and they're putting a lot of blame into the mix. That doesn't actually help this situation. It doesn't help to alleviate the shadow, because it is shadow. So standing in the truth is standing in the light. It's standing in clarity in the light. And that is being of love and being of alignment, right? So we're recognizing that we can't fix, we can't get involved. We have to stay in what is true and clear. Okay? You can respond with clarity and compassion. And that means you can say what it like, you can acknowledge what it is that the person is wanting or needing, and then also say, and this is, I need to do what's right for me, right? I can see you want this, and this is what I need to do for me. So basically, you're separating in that point in time, and you're saying, you get to have your need, and I get to have my need. And I'm saying that in a loving and compassionate way, so that we can both do our best to do that, right? Sometimes those things are at cross purposes with each other. And that's okay. Everybody, that's this kind of thing we work out in relationship. If that can't ever be okay with someone, then you're starting to get into a deeply problematic area. So you don't want to spiritualize avoidance. And I was mentioning this before, but like cutting someone off and calling it alignment is really just your shadow, right? Like saying, oh, I need to listen to myself and my truth. And like that's a way of like actually just saying to the other person, you're being bad and wrong, and therefore, or some other version, right? That actually isn't helping. that type of avoidance isn't really, no matter how nice it looks, it isn't really helping. So is your boundary punishing them for making you feel something or making you uncomfortable in some way? Because if your boundary is a punishment, then it's not really going to help to resolve the situation. So your boundary needs to be because it is taking care of you in your world, and it's saying, "Hey, no, this is the line that is being drawn." So you want to speak to the deeper truth of what you see as well. Right? So, in other words, you could say, like, I hear you blaming me, but I wonder if you're feeling afraid that I'm pulling away, right? This invites honesty overall. And I mean, if somebody is really, really kind of deeply in their stuff, it can bring up some challenges. But what you're saying overall is you're helping to bring clarity forward. You're helping to name what it is that's going on inside. So if this energy is manipulative, it often represents itself in a way that is not true to what's going on. So getting to the heart of it is actually something that moves into a truer, deeper, um, relationship with the self, a truer, deeper orientation to the feminine. So you also need to know when to walk away. So the holding space for the shadow is not an opening to be abused. So you can love someone and you can still choose to not be in the dynamic. So you don't just because you're aware of these different things doesn't mean that you should put up with these different pieces of things. You need to know when the line has been crossed and it is become either problematic for you. So in other words, you are not able to handle it in a healthy way because of who you are, and how you're coming to the moment, or because it's outright abusive. It can be labeled as abuse, and that is something that you need to remove yourself from. So, what does healing look like overall? So, it looks like honesty, it looks like radical honesty, like being willing to say what is and isn't, to honor our wants, our needs, our emotions, how we see a particular situation. And it looks like reclaiming power without performing. So being able to stand in our own knowing of our power and ability without needing to like make it be something for someone. And it also looks like honoring the sacred mess of it all. So it takes a lot to dig in the dirt and to pull up these pieces of ourself from, from shadow. And that is not always neat. It can be quite messy at times. So we wanna honor that, like not in the way of just allowing mess to beget mess, but in the way of acknowledging the fact that like sometimes you can't bake a cake without breaking a few eggs, or so it's like you want to acknowledge the fact that in whatever it is that you're creating that it's not always a smooth ride, and you can learn to just say, okay, yep, these are things that I've done, right? I've overgiven, I've manipulated, I've withheld. It's like, so just acknowledgement. What are the behaviors? What are these behaviors that I've done? How have I done them, right? And from there we can start to learn to relate differently. So we acknowledge, yes, this is how I have been, but this is how I can try to do it differently. We start to set our boundaries without shame. We honor our intuition. and we stop trying to earn love by disappearing, so the nature of this is the negation of the self, in order to be loved. And so because it's like no matter what we're doing, we're negating the true self and the true self's desires when we are compensating in this way. We're not allowing our full self to come through. So that's the reclamation of the feminine, right? It's not the polished, performative one, right? It's the true feminine that is able to be rooted and unshamed and wise. It's helpful to do some things around this, to have some practices around this. And one of them is a devotion to honesty. So, in any moment in time, and to get to what it is that we're afraid to say to ourselves, to others, and really get to the honesty of that situation, choosing that radical honesty inside of ourselves and outside of ourselves, because it's the radical honesty that brings us into actual relationship. So regardless of what the outcome of that is, we can choose to be willing to be more honest, to look at these places, to look at these behaviors, to look at how this shows up in our life, whether inside of us or outside of ourselves. And in order that we are able to see ourselves more clearly, in order that we're able to grow, we want to practice our boundaries and really start to explore our no, so that we can give space for our yes. And so this process isn't a process that happens just in a moment, right? And doesn't happen, just instantaneously. It'd be so nice if it would sometimes, but it doesn't it doesn't happen like that. It happens over time. It's built in layers, and it happens each time we choose truth, right? And truth over performance, presence over pattern. We allow ourselves to be in that place of truth and vulnerability, so that we can, expand. Overall, this shadow feminine is not our enemy. It's our teacher. And it's the part of you that says, like, there's more to you than this role that you're playing. And when we stop rejecting her, we start becoming whole. And the relationships take on more depth, right? They stop being performance, they stop being a place, like a stage, but instead they're an altar, where we can return to truth. And we don't have to be perfect, we just have to be present, honest, true, and take the next step. So, wherever you find yourself today, whatever pattern is surfacing or whatever relationship is revealing your next layer, know this: you're not broken, you're becoming. And the shadow is not in the way of your wholeness. She is the way to your wholeness. So thank you for being here in this conversation. And if today's episode spoke to you, I invite you to continue the journey inside of Sacred Lights, where you can explore these themes. And you'll have access to the live Roar of Love podcasts. As always, stay open and stay true. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for listening to the Roar of Love podcast. If today's episode spoke to you, visit Sacred Lights at sacredlights.com for more insights and guidance on your journey. Until next time, stay open, stay true, and keep answering love's call.